Shakumaku, and welcome to another Iraq Matters. I'm Carly Miller, the newest member of the EPIC team. On this week's show, we have an Iraq update with Ahmed Ali. Then, to mark the 2-year anniversary of the U.S. troop withdrawal from Iraq, we sit down with Kirk Johnson, the founder of the LIST Project, an organization dedicated to protecting Iraqis who had worked with the U.S. government and whose lives are now at risk as a result. Kirk is out with a new book, To Be a Friend is Fatal, The Fight to Save the Iraqis America Left Behind. EPIC first sat down and interviewed Kirk Johnson in the summer of 2007 for our Ground Truth project, and we worked closely with Kirk and other colleagues to get legislation passed in Congress, namely the Refugee Crisis in Iraq Act. It was passed because of a bipartisan group of Senate leaders that included the late Senator Ted Kennedy. In addition to ensuring increased assistance for displaced and vulnerable Iraqis, the legislation also set up a special immigrant visa program for Iraqis under threat as a result of their work with the U.S. government. Kirk's story and work are all the more urgent today, 2 years since the U.S. troop withdrawal. Right now, the Special Immigrant Visa, or SIV program, is scheduled to end at the end of the year, even though more than 3,500 eligible Iraqis under that program are still awaiting visas. Following our interview with Kirk Johnson, we close out this week's podcast with the second part of our interview with the groundbreaking journalist Yasmeen Alamiri, who discusses her recent story on Iraqi refugees and the contributions they make to communities across the U.S. Also, we'll be highlighting the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project. Now for a humanitarian update. Thanks to our special report by the freelance journalist Kathy Otten and photographer Jacob Russell, Iraq Matters has learned there are roughly 126,000 non-camp refugees in Iraq. As a whole, non-camp refugees make up 80% of the region's refugee population. Non-camp refugees often rent or live with friends and family. In addition, many live in makeshift shelters and abandoned buildings. Many of these makeshift shelters only have a few sheets of blue tarp to keep out the harsh winter temperatures. The UNHCR does, however, provide monetary assistance to the most vulnerable of non-camp refugees. According to the UNHCR, aid agencies find themselves in a difficult position when providing aid to non-camp refugees. If they provide aid to the refugees, aid must also be given to the local communities. Even still, many decide they do not want to rely on outside help from aid agencies and attempt to build new lives while facing the challenge of finding a home, work, and food. You can read the full report and see photos at epic-usa.org. The UNHCR regional appeal right now for Syrian refugees is 69% funded, while the Iraq appeal is only 53%. But you can help. Go to www.unrefugees.org. Your donation can make the difference on whether a family sleeps tonight in the cold. Please keep these families in your thoughts this holiday season, and thank you for sharing our appeal and special report. The organization behind this podcast, the Education for Peace in Iraq Center, also known as EPIC, is hosting a petition on change.org, urging President Obama and Congress to support a long-term strategy for peace in Iraq by supporting Iraqis through USAID projects and working with internal groups to include minorities. That petition now has almost 8,200 signatures, and our goal is 10,000. Now over to Eric and Ahmed Ali for our Iraq update.
Hi, this is Eric Gustafson with a special Iraq update. I'm actually recording this from the offices of the Institute for the Study of War with Ahmed Ali. So this month marks the 2-year anniversary of the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq. 2 years later, what are the current trends? Is al-Qaeda in Iraq, for example, becoming stronger? Is it getting weaker? And what are the most recent security developments that have occurred that suggest what the trends are right now?
Since 2011 and in the immediate withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq, political conditions in Iraq have deteriorated. We have seen the beginning of anti-government protest movement, primarily led by the Iraqi Sunnis. There has been considerable consolidation of power by Prime Minister Maliki, and that has caused concern for his political opponents and for observers of Iraqi affairs. And you have also seen the rise of al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI in the country. And those trends are concerning trends, and Iraq is approaching elections in 2014, in April of next year, and therefore it will be important to watch how those elections will play a role in either increasing violence or decreasing violence in the country.
And recent security developments, I know in the Kurdistan region, for example, an area that hasn't really seen much violence or terrorist attacks for many, many years. There was recently an attack in Erbil, and there was even a couple cars that had been bombed in Sulaymaniyah, and then most recently in Kirkuk. Can you tell us a little bit about some of these recent developments, and are they out of ordinary? What does it suggest in terms of whether or not conditions are getting better or worse in Iraq?
Well, certainly the developments in Iraq Kurdistan with regards to security affairs are very unusual, because the region does not normally see suicide bombings. That happened in Erbil with an attack on the security forces headquarters, and you also had a number of sticky bomb attacks in Sulaymaniyah. That doesn't happen a lot either. Then the major attack happened last week in Kirkuk City, with suicide bombers attacking the intelligence headquarters and later on an adjacent commercial mall. And those attacks resulted in clashes for 10 hours. And the Kirkuk attack is also unusual because it happened inside Kirkuk City, and normally those attacks happen in rural areas, not in urban areas.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and happy holidays, happy New Year.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's always a pleasure to be on Iraq Matters, and happy holidays to you and your listeners.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric and Ahmed. Here is Mary now with her interview with Kirk Johnson.
Kirk went to work in Iraq in 2004 with USAID through the International Resources Group. Following his time in Iraq, Kirk founded the LIST Project in 2007. The project was founded to provide pro bono legal aid to Iraqi citizens that helped the United States during the Iraq War and are seeking resettlement because of immediate danger due to their involvement with us. Since 2007, the LIST Project has been able to push through numerous pending visa applications and bring these Iraqis to the United States for resettlement. In September 2013, Johnson wrote his memoir, To Be a Friend is Fatal, The Fight to Save the Iraqis America Left Behind, about the 7-year struggle the LIST Project has had trying to protect the thousands of Iraqis that are on the list. We at EPIC would like to inform you at this time that there were some technical difficulties while this interview was conducted. We apologize for the inconvenience. In 2007, a bipartisan group of senators led by the late Ted Kennedy introduced S-1651, the Refugee Crisis in Iraq Act, to create a special designation for Iraqis who had been working with the United States and their families. Under the legislation, qualified Iraqis would include anyone who had worked directly with the U.S. government or been associated with a media agency or NGO based in the United States, or any organization that had either received a grant from the U.S. or entered into a cooperative agreement or contract with the U.S. government. The act authorized the U.S. to admit as many as 5,000 Iraqi refugees into the U.S. per year. EPIC and a coalition of national organizations, including the LIST Project, worked hard for the swift passage of Senator Kennedy's legislation, which was signed into law in early 2008. We asked Kirk what the special immigration visa program was created for.
This program was created explicitly for Iraqis who work for the U.S. government inside Iraq, or else its contractors or subcontractors that were either assisting the military or who were assisting us in our reconstruction efforts throughout Iraq. They are Iraqis that worked a minimum of 1 year in good standing, and the U.S. government still doesn't have a hard number as to how many Iraqis we're talking about, but between about 50 and 100,000 people. Any entity that received funding through the Iraq Reconstruction and Relief Fund, which was sort of the primary tranche of funds for the reconstruction, their Iraqi employees theoretically should be eligible for this. In theory, it's the janitors that were sweeping the hallways of the USAID compound. It's the education advisors and health advisors that were helping us on reconstruction projects throughout the country. It was meant to be the entire gamut of Iraqis who were helping us.
When the war began in 2003, many Iraqis welcomed the U.S., but as the fighting continued, sentiments worsened.
In the early months of the war, there wasn't a stigma about working with the Americans. The people that were stepping forward to help were actually celebrated in the first 6 months or so of the war as the bridge of sorts between the Iraqis and the Americans, this group of people that were willing to work and that understood the language and this kind of thing. But as the occupation foundered and as we started becoming, frankly, more brutal in our administration of the country, as things like Abu Ghraib surfaced, all of these checkpoints that we were putting up throughout the country, we started to lose the Iraqi populace. The insurgency started, and really the softest underbelly of the American occupation in Iraq were these Iraqis who were helping us. It's much easier to kill one of them than it is to kill a U.S. soldier or a U.S. Marine or a diplomat. A downward cycle started in March and April of 2004, and then basically these people were caught in our camp. They had made the decision at a more sort of innocent moment in the war to help us, and because of our failures, a stigma surrounded them that persists even today, but it meant in very practical terms, it meant that they had to go to great lengths to conceal their identities, to hide the fact that they worked for the Americans, and so this meant taking multiple taxis or buses in different directions each morning to throw off anyone who might be suspicious of them and trailing them so that they would not be observed walking into the green zone. We're routinely sniped at, mortared, occasionally suicide car bombs would drive into them. Once you're in the Americans' camp, you almost can only work with the Americans from that point onwards.
While in Iraq, Kirk worked with an Iraqi worker named Yagdan.
Yagdan is a prime example of another type of Iraqi that was helping us. He was working on a fairly huge project with aid. We had about a $130 million program to rebuild schools throughout Iraq, to train teachers in new pedagogy, to get school supplies for children in each of the provinces. It was everything from basic to higher education. And he would, sneak into the green zone every day past these checkpoints to basically help us manage this project, which actually had a lot of positive impacts compared to other sectors of the reconstruction.
Yagdan's work with Kirk brought him into the path of danger, and eventually he would have to hide his movements to and from the compound.
He did everything he could sometimes it'd be wearing a hat or sunglasses or a shamag or wearing different clothes in the evening than he wore in the morning. And, he kept this up for 3 years. I think he believed in the work that he was doing. He saw that it was making an impact on the lives of his fellow Iraqis. And so, I think a lot of times people just write off the entire reconstruction as a total joke. And I'm as rough of a critic of the reconstruction as there is, but there were very positive things that we achieved. We should have been able to do a lot more, but I think he was motivated by the work that was being done. But also there's another kind of unpleasant reality to this, which is that once you're in the Americans' camp, you almost can only work with the Americans from that point onwards. And so if he had tried to go work somewhere else and they looked at his resume and asked who he'd been working for the last few years, he wouldn't be able to tell them, and that would be kind of a bit of a tell in and of itself. So in some ways he was kind of trapped with us.
While working in Iraq, Kirk developed post-traumatic stress disorder. While on a short break from Iraq, a shocking accident happened to Kirk. He entered into a stress-induced fugue state and fell from a window. Months of psychological and physical therapy followed the accident, and Kirk fell into a deep depression.
I felt like I had just completely failed. I had just spent a year trying to help rebuild the country. I had just been impacted when I got to Fallujah, the balance, but I went to Iraq in order to try to do the things that I was doing in Fallujah. And then I have this PTSD triggered accident, and I'm nearly dead. The projects that I started in Fallujah, they unraveled in my absence, and I couldn't get back in time. They never replaced me in Fallujah. And so, I basically could not point to a single thing that I thought would last. I felt like I had tried really hard and I hadn't been good enough, and then I had this accident and I couldn't even achieve the small things I was trying to achieve over there. And so, I felt like the whole thing had been completely pointless, and not to mention it had nearly destroyed me. And so I spent most of 2006 in a fairly intense state of depression. I was wrestling against post-traumatic stress and the same few nightmares that would come every night. And I wanted nothing to do with Iraq at that point in my life. Really, it was a single email from my friend Yagdan, who, after several years of Dubai, he sent me an email asking for help. And that email was sort of the wake up where I realized I should just stop feeling sorry for myself and that my friends were in a much worse place than I was.
After hearing from Yagdan, Kirk created a list of all of the Iraqis that had worked with him at USAID and were seeking refuge in the United States. This was the beginning of the LIST project. The visa process for these Iraqi heroes is currently in a period of stagnation, where the waiting process is not measured in weeks but in years.
At the end of this past fiscal year, the special immigrant visa program for Iraqis who had worked for the U.S. expired. And basically, the program has always been a profoundly flawed program, but basically when it was created through the efforts of Senator Kennedy and the President Coalition, we acknowledged an obligation to a minimum of 25,000 of these Iraqis who worked for us. And the legislation needed to hand out 5,000 of these visas each year for 5 years. And having worked with, and because I know the people that drafted the legislation, was no one ever anticipated what happened at the end of this past fiscal year. No one anticipated that that legislation would expire and take with it something like 17,000 visas of the 25,000. 17,000 visas that were never issued due to bureaucratic incompetence, apathy, self-imposed state of fear. A number of factors, but essentially the overwhelming majority of those visas, the majority were never given out. And so there's been a flurry of advocacy and lobbying to try to revive the program and to keep it alive. And in fact, 30 minutes before the government shutdown, a 90-day extension cleared the Senate. It took a couple weeks or so for the House to do their part. But we now have a 90-day extension, which takes us until the end of December of 2013. At the current state of processing, 90 days is not going to make much of a difference. And so it's been I feel a little like I'm the curmudgeonly sort of wet blanket, but there were all these people that were issuing press releases and bragging about how we have now honored our obligation to these Iraqis because of this 90-day extension. At the current pace of processing, we actually would need an extension of about 17 years. The debate is the objectives and the debate itself are so off mark at this point that I think we've become a country that we pass these laws and we feel good about ourselves, and then we turn our backs on the implementation of these laws. And so everyone's thrilled now about all of the articles and all of the, all of the press releases and all of this stuff about this 90-day renewal. All we're doing is renewing a comatose program. These people are going to continue to basically die in the bureaucracy until President Obama makes this a priority. Now, the problem here is not with Congress. Congress has routinely passed legislation to honor our obligation to these Iraqis. They have done their part, and oddly enough, I'm in this weird position of defending Congress because they've done well on this. Every single time that they send a bill over about Iraqi refugees to the executive branch, whether or not it's Bush or Obama, the executive branch attorneys and bureaucracies basically nullify the legislation through executive fiat. It can take, if you're an Iraqi and you show up at our embassy tomorrow in Baghdad, it can take between 1 and 2 years before you get your very first interview, at which point it might take another 18 to 24 months of processing. And this is what the largest embassy on the face of the planet and in the history of the human race has to offer, is a 2-year wait for Iraqis who risk their lives for us. And so I can guarantee you that if President Obama instructed his agencies to hand out those remaining 17,000 visas, if he actually uttered a sentence about this, those same bureaucrats are not going to wait 2 years to do the interviews. What is creating this 2-year wait period is a primal fear of brown people. I'm sorry to say it. It's not that it's because there's some form that if we just tweak this piece of paper in the State Department or Homeland Security, it's going to get better. What's holding this up is because none of these people want their names to be on the signature of the next, on the visa of the next 9/11 hijacker's visa. You know, they don't want their names on the paperwork of a bad guy. And so what they do is they slow the program down to a glacial pace. They look for reasons to say no to people. Iraqis who worked for us are presumed guilty of terrorism unless we can prove them innocent. The logjam is a self-imposed and irrational paranoia of these people. And that happens and that persists because there's no presidential leadership. Do you really think that people were thrilled to be letting in a bunch of Vietnamese into this country after a war in which we lost 58,000 Americans? It wasn't until President Ford went before the nation and he said, we have to help these people. It wasn't until Ford said that we have to help these people and that to do less would be to add moral shame to humiliation. And within 2 weeks of that speech in 1975, he had a $600 million act passed by Congress. Within a couple months, we brought 130,000 Vietnamese to our country. And within a few years, we reached roughly 1 million that we brought in. And every American has grown up with Vietnamese and Laotian classmates. And they've done huge things for this country. But that happened after the president stepped up. And when Clinton stepped up in '96 to help Iraqis in the north, when he stepped up to help Kosovar Albanians, it didn't take 2 years to give these people visas. And so that's what's so maddening about this whole issue, is that there actually is a silver bullet solution. We've already recognized that we want to give out 25,000 visas, and we have immense resources to save these people's lives. But because there's no presidential leadership, our policy is basically, yes, we'll think about giving you a visa if you can live long enough. And to me, that's why I think history is going to be pretty cruel in its judgment of us on this, as it should be. Obama doesn't even need to relitigate, to use his favorite term. We've already expressed a commitment to these people. This is in the end a matter of government efficiency, which sounds like a boring argument here, but this is embarrassing. And there's no way that if he issues an executive order to DOD to conduct an airlift or to start tasking resources with our base in Guam, I mean, all of this stuff sounds crazy unless you spend 10 minutes looking at the history of refugee admissions in the United States, and we've done this nearly every decade. We just don't do it with these people because we don't have any leadership.
Of the 6 bipartisan co-sponsors for the original bill, 2 of the co-signers, Senators Joe Biden and Chuck Hagel, are now at the top of the administration. Biden is, of course, vice president and Hagel is the Secretary of Defense. They have a direct link to the president, and yet there continues to be no improvement. There are some in Congress that continue to work to help these people. Senator Patrick Leahy signed the original SIV legislation and is still working on these issues today. Other lawmakers committed to implementing the SIV legislation include Senators Jeanne Shaheen, John McCain, and Leslie Graham, and Representatives Adam Kissinger, Tulsi Gabbard, Chris Gibson, Steny Hoyer, and Duncan Hunter.
That story was brought to us by Mary Zell, and I have her here with us in the studio. Mary, I know you read Kirk's book before you interviewed him. Could I ask you some questions about the book, possibly?
Sure, of course.
Okay. What was your reaction to reading his book?
So my favorite thing about the book is how he managed to intertwine personal stories with the larger political context. So, of course, he has his own story. He has his own personal story, including studying Arabic and then studying Middle East before he worked in Iraq and his experiences in Iraq. He has his friend Yahdin's story, and he really manages to intertwine these personal stories closely with the larger context, like not only the war in Iraq, but the SIV legislation. And so it was a really interesting read. It wasn't too abstract. The larger context wasn't too abstract because you could really see how it affected these two lives on a personal level.
In your own words, why does Kirk's book matter?
Well, in my opinion, it's really important that his book came out now, that it came out recently, because, the United States withdrew from Iraq several years ago, and I really see a reluctance for both among the U.S. public and the U.S. government to really focus on Iraq and really talk about Iraq. But this book reminds us that while the Iraq war is over for our troops, it is not over for Iraqis, and there are still people in danger, and they are in danger because they worked with us.
That's great. So, to learn how Yagdan's story ended and other insights from Kirk Johnson, buy his book, To Be a Friend is Fatal, The Fight to Save the Iraqis America Left Behind. There's a link to Amazon at the bottom of this podcast, and for your convenience, we're also going to put the information on our Facebook page. In continuing our conversation between Eric Gustafson and Yasmeen Alamiri, they discuss Iraqis' impact on American communities following relocation.
Because of Iraq's history, whether it was under the regime and under sanctions or going even back to the Iran-Iraq War, and then of course more recently, prior to Syria's civil war, one of the biggest displacement crises the region had ever seen was happening in Iraq in 2006, 2007. Many Iraqis who also had worked with the Americans are being resettled through the Special Immigrant Visa SIV program, and also just people being resettled through the normal channels of UNHCR and other agencies. Many Iraqis, thousands, coming to the United States. You recently wrote a story about the Iraqi diaspora in the United States, Dearborn,
Right.
Michigan, and different cities.
So I actually really love this story. Sometimes you worry about Iraqis being plucked, I think that's a nice word for it, out of their country. I don't think a lot of these people willingly left. I think I've spoken to a lot of Iraqis that have come here either as immigrants or as refugees. And I always ask them one question, which is, if you had the chance and if you had the choice, would you be living in Iraq still? And they say, of course we would still be in Iraq. If it wasn't not the Iraq now, but in the Iraq that we remember, the Iraq that we love, of course we would. And so you always worry that these people would come here and they would have a sense of resentment, or they won't become acclimated in the same way that you would hope. But what we found, maybe it's because we did it in the context, our interviews were in the context of Dearborn, which is a very interesting social study because there's so many Arabs there. It's like, I said in my article, it's often regarded as like little Iraq because it's easy for you to walk around and find shops that are only selling Arabic food or speaking Arabic. And so it was nice to speak to people there because I think that it shows what Iraqis are capable of. Highlights the sense of the human capital that comes from the Iraqi citizenry. They're very hard workers, they're very creative, they're very intelligent and savvy and resourceful. And I think when they're taken out of the confines of a system that has been so deeply plagued by corruption and lack of confidence and also patronizing behavior, from so many different countries placed onto Iraq, these Iraqis here are able to flourish. They're able to build their own companies or build their own little shops, small businesses, and provide for both their families and their communities. There's a strong sense of giving back. And that was a really, really interesting story. I really liked it. I think that renewed my faith in the Iraqi diaspora and what that could mean for Iraqis within Iraq.
It's really exciting. I'm thinking of some of the Iraqis who I got to know when I was there, and especially younger people, how I got the sense that there was a frustration because they really wanted opportunities, but they felt like it was about who you knew.
Sure.
Having a member of the family in one of the ruling political parties, because otherwise you're not going to get a job, and not being able to advance based on merit, but then coming here to the United States where clearly it's not perfect. There's still a lot of issues. but you have much more of an opportunity to advance based on merit. If you work hard and do well, you have a chance at, the American dream.
Well, we have a word in Arabic, it's called wasla. And wasla is the exact concept that you described, which is you have a friend. I mean, God help us, like you're qualified, you're not qualified, you'll get the job because your friend is putting you in place. And that's, it really like undermines your whole sense of, exactly as you say, a meritocracy. Yeah. Then that doesn't mean that the hardest worker is not going to get the job. The hardest worker is not going to get the praise or the promotion. And that's really disheartening. If you see it happen over and over again and you know that it's only based on this wasla, then you don't even want to try anymore, right? It ends up like crippling an entire either generation or set of people, and it doesn't foster any kind of need or necessity to work hard. But I think what I'm really impressed by, and this is what makes me happy, is that though there's been systematic corruption or like this bolstering of this idea of wasla, these Iraqis that are a product of this have come here and they are able to resort back to their savviness and their resourcefulness. Yeah. So it wasn't completely beaten out of them, which I'm actually very, very impressed, and it makes me very happy. And it's sad that you have to kind of take them out of their native habitat to watch them thrive, but it's still there.
It's actually still very useful to have friends in high places, and be able to call in favors. And it's the ability to network very well. And certainly the community has been very effective in that.
Sure.
I actually am thinking of our mutual friend of ours, Andy Shalal, who owns Busboys and Poets. And he is now, for our listeners who are tuning in from places outside of Washington, D.C., we have to tell you, and if you're in D.C., anyone who lives here, everybody knows Busboys and Poets. It's fantastic restaurants. And he's now running for mayor here in Washington, D.C. So to have the Iraqi-American as the mayor of D.C. would be
cool.
And not at all surprising to me. So.
And it's always so nice to see, like, even if he's not, it's not like he is going to advance the Iraqi agenda, but it's so nice to see that someone like one of your own, an Iraqi-American, do something. Yeah. Do something that is not for political advancement to become the head of an Iraqi party. Mm-hmm. It's within his community here. And he wants to give back to his community here in D.C. Yeah. And he's, campaigning on things like small businesses and things that really resonate for the community here. Has no alternative, agenda. And that's really refreshing and that's really nice. And that's something that I think Iraqis, both Iraqi-Americans and Iraqis, can be very proud of.
I joke with him that he's more American than I am.
Yeah.
He's truly impressive.
For this podcast, we at Epic wanted to shine a light on an organization that has been instrumental in not only the SIV legislation process, but also the fight to bring Iraqis to the U.S. The Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project was started by Yale law students who wanted to provide legal representation to Iraqi citizens that were trying to settle in the United States. Their organization is comprised of 1,000 legal representatives and law students. Their goals are to protect Iraqis and Afghanis that risk their lives when they help the U.S. military and to provide pro bono legal representation for refugees. The IRAP also advocates to Congress to protect the Iraqi and Afghani special immigrant visa programs. To learn more about the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project, go to their website at www.refugeerights.org. They're an amazing organization, and we at Epic would like to thank you for your work. We have an exciting update in regards to the special immigration visa programs. On December 12th, the House of Representatives passed the National Defense Authorization Act. This act contained the necessary extension the Iraqi special immigrant visa program needed in order to continue its purpose of protecting Iraqis who had risked their lives through aiding the United States. The act is expected to pass Congress before they go on their recess on Friday. It would require a senior coordinator to be appointed to head the program. This would allow members of Congress and the public to have a point of contact. Accountability is key, and this is a step in the right direction. The Act also extends the application deadline to September 2004 at the end of the fiscal year. Lastly, the Act enables the creation of 2,500 more Iraqi visas that will be available indefinitely to applicants, so they will never expire. Though these are big improvements, there is still a lot to be done. The president still has to exert influence on the bureaucracy so that the extended visa wait game no longer happens. You can call your state congressional delegation and urge them to not forget about these special people. The program will have to be extended past September 2014 to accommodate the backlog of applicants. Unfortunately, the Afghani SIV program did not receive the same extension as the Iraqi program and will require more work. If you have a story to tell, a comment to share, or a burning question you need an answer to, send us an email to info@epic-usa.org or a tweet using the hashtag #IraqMatters. As always, you can find us on Facebook as well. One more thing before we go. Steve Skinner wrote to us after listening to episode 8 and told us a bit of his story. He said in an email to us, "I was over there for about a year and a half between 2004 and 2009. I recently helped at least 2 people to come over here under the special visa program. These individuals were local national employees for the same company I worked for. One settled in Austin, Texas, and the other in Richmond, Virginia." Thanks, Steve, for your support, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. We at EPIC also want to thank Ahmed Ali, Kirk Johnson, Yasmeen Alamiri, Jen Smyers of Church World Service, and Catherine Reesner of the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project for helping this podcast come together. Help us grow our audience by voting for us on podcastland.com, by searching for Iraq Matters, and help us reach a wider audience. This is Carly Miller reminding you that Iraq matters.